Focus, people. Let's stay focused. It's your boy Tom 202. I just made a video about how YouTube was basically wrecking dreams. I need a hat on today. There I is. How YouTube is wrecking people's dreams. But you know, it is what it is. I got some interesting comments last night from a guy who wrote me a dossier on the history of, let me see if I can pull this up. He wrote on the history of the flag and the national anthem. Here's what I gotta say to you. I'm gonna spell your name Xarmydoc. I want to say this. Thank you for your comment. And it's rather lengthy, and you did what I ask a lot of people to do when we're talking about serious topics like this. Topics that have caused lives and changed lives. You asked me to do my research, and I thank you for that. You know, I didn't look at your comment as snide. I didn't look at it as, this is just some dude trying to change my mind, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. I looked at your comment in a very didactic, educational, fashion, as in, I need to be up on my game. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. And that's highly possible because I haven't researched the national anthem past what I read about Francis Scott Key and, what he had already written. So, when it comes to, staples in our lives, like the national anthem, let's just face it, the majority of us don't know, we don't know too much about it. We just put a hand over our heart, and as tradition goes, this is why tradition is such a killer, is because, and it's a killer of spirits is what it is. Because people are like, I've been doing it for the longest time, and I'm not gonna change. You got your old spiritual people, I've been giving the church 10% of my tithes, and I'm not going to change. That's just the way they are. The Bible has nothing to do with giving 10% of your money, So you can't change people's minds on some things. When it comes to the national anthem, it's hard to change people's minds on the national anthems. Why? Because it's been out since the 1800s or something like that. According to you, it was, let's see, version 18. It was finalized in 1931, somewhere to that nature. So I'm just gonna read some of your comments because I really, really, really appreciate you going into depth into this. One thing about this, though, I'm gonna say this: I do not get too far into lengthy comments unless I'm really, 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 really interested in it, and unless you guys are constantly on this topic and it's something that I think is pertinent. Like when you guys get to talking gematria and stuff, I can't. You guys want to talk about this other guy who does predictions? I looked at his channel, and I didn't listen to a word he had to say, not one. Although we know there are other skeptical channels out there. Okay, so I'm just going to read this, and I'm saying when you leave me a comment, don't leave me a whole history. But you did one thing I really did like. You left me references. So that's always a plus. If you leave me something I can go back and read when I have some free time, fine. I go to class on Saturdays. I study like Thursday night, Friday, and then go to class on Saturday. So, okay, there it is. As far as my time, as far as looking something up. Okay, so the national anthem is racist as hell. This is what I said. And you're saying wrong, Mr. what is it? Ex-Army Doc. Oh, so you're a military person. Okay, thank you for your service, ex-Army Doc. You're saying wrong. Francis Scott Key wrote verse 3 to gloat over the deaths of the liberated slaves who fought for the British in the War of 1812. Now, this right here, this just first little bit right here is what most of us know. Now, we're seeing the slaves were black people. You're saying the slaves were Russians. So let's get into this. Now, before I go further into this, listen, it's going to take a minute for people to really understand what you're saying. Okay, you're saying the slaves were one color, and we know as a black man and as people, as Americans, we know that we were slaves back then. So it's gonna be hard to convince somebody that, oh, this white guy wasn't talking about, us as slaves, Negroes as slaves. Like, we didn't die for this country, we didn't fight for this country, and the British didn't offer us, a better, whatever, even though the British had us in slavery too. So I guess what I'm saying is, when it all boils down to it, buddy, the black people we are still getting shot and killed today. We're still getting hung today. Like, okay, I'm gonna go into it, but it's like, listen, you're just not going to convince me that they wasn't hanging, killing, and cutting off my toes, raping my mother and father, and and killing. You're just not going to convince me that wasn't happening to us. However, you're trying to convince me that this wasn't written for us, and it's going to be a while before I'm like, yeah, you're right. Okay, I'm going to really have to get into it. But nonetheless, okay. Deaths of libertarian slaves who fought for the British in the War of 1812. It is a hoax, as vicious as a hoax as Tawana Brawley hoax. I don't know who that is. Prepared by the race baiters Al Sharpton. Okay, I need to look into that, I guess. As vicious as the Duke rape hoax. I did look into the Duke rape hoax, and when you say hoax, it's somebody set this up to be fake. Okay, when you say hoax, you know what I'm saying? When I look at this, and I don't look at the Duke rape as a hoax. The girl she was lying. Now, who set her up to do it, I don't know. But it just, immediately when I saw the Duke rape case, I automatically thought it was a lie. So just to go show you there, and there was a black girl who was lying on white teens. Okay, so let's just get that out the way. In other words, I'm not a racist. I don't automatically jump to the black people's side. I look at it like, because I've been an investigator before, and that's your job, to look at, all sides. I work for the Ohio House of Representatives. Okay, I'm gonna tone this down a little bit so we can go ahead and go. If there was a wholesale killing of liberated American slaves in the War of 1812, where and when did it happen? Okay, for one, you're asking if there was a wholesale killing of slaves. Nobody has said that. We're seeing that there were slaves, African American people, who wanted to have a better life, and the British at that time was offering that to the African American slaves at that point. That's what we're saying. And I am still convinced that's the truth. I'm still convinced that Francis Scott Key did not have my black ass and my benefit in mind. You're not going to convince me of that, regardless of who he said slaves was. White people in this country, especially during that time, we were slaves. Point blank. Listen, and what's really crazy is, it don't matter what color the slaves were. A slave is a slave is a slave, is an indentured servant. So whether there were white slaves who came from Russia, or Russia did have slaves of their own, and whether it was the black slaves who came from America or from Africa that came through Mesopotamia and Egypt and all that, it doesn't matter. He was talking about slaves. He didn't say black slaves or white slaves. He said slaves. Okay? We know in this country that black people were and still are slaves. So let's just cut that out. All right. There was wholesale killing 1812s. Where did it happen? It did not happen on the Battle of Washington and Baltimore. That doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. It did not happen in 1814. Yes, the Corps of Colonial Marines were part of the British Army, which fought in those battles. Okay, I don't know who the Corps of Colonial Marines are, but I know who the colored troops were. You know what I'm saying? I know those guys. I know Tuskegee Airmen. I know what happened at Tuskegee. You know what I'm saying? I know with the syphilis, I know what happened then, and you can't tell me that those people weren't slaves. Okay, maybe you should look into that too. The Corps of Colonial Marines took a total of 8 casualties in those battles. You need to leave me a reference for that. 1 killed and 7 wounded. You mean to tell me that? Okay, for one, you're narrowing down the Corps of Marines. So you're saying that these were probably colored people. Okay, fine. You're saying that there were very few of them killed during that war. Listen, that doesn't make me know, never mind. Simply because, look, if they were Corps of Colonial Marines, to me, they were not dubbed as slaves during that time. They were not slaves, okay? They were military men. We are talking about free slaves who wanted a better life, so they had to pick a side. You're talking about a military individual who fought for whose ever side. Okay, now I don't know if you're saying that these individuals were drafted in, and when they were drafted in, they were slaves. They were drafted in, and this is who they were, the Colonial Marines. Okay, but were they still slaves as a Colonial Marines? What was their choice? You know what I'm saying? We need to look further into that. But I'm talking about free slaves who had a choice. Okay, running around pretty much like militia or whatever. Like, what are you gonna do? And by the way, all these cowboys that you guys see, listen, 1 in every 3 individuals that were cowboys, they were black because they were slaves. They were free slaves. Okay, so all these cowboy stories you see, whatever. Yes, the Corps of Colonial Marines were part of the British Army, which fought in the battle. Colonial took a total of 8 casualties. Okay, we already went over that. Other than that, the British raid in Chesapeake in 1813 and the Battle of Washington and Baltimore, the Corps Colonial Marines played a very minor. That doesn't matter to me. Play a very minor part in the war. That doesn't matter to me. I'm going to go ahead and end this video, and we can get on into it more if you want to go ahead and send me more information, or any of you guys want to go ahead and chime in. Eventually, I will do some looking into it. It's going to take me a couple days because I have accounting to look into all day today and tomorrow. But nonetheless, we're going to get into this. We're going to find out who the Colonial Marines were, and then we're going to find out how many free slaves actually fought during that time. But I am still convinced that Francis Scott Key was not just talking about white slaves, if there were any at that time. And I'm pretty sure that the national anthem was not written with black people in mind for their betterment. It's your boy Tone 202, and once again, thank you for your comment. It's very insightful.